I have dreamed of first contact with alien life since I first read a science fiction novel when I was 8 years old. Gabriel said with quiet horror in his voice as his wide eyes stared in disbelief at what he was seeing. I thought that somewhere out there in the endless stars, we would find new friends, new dreamers, and that we could adventure through the night, seeing camaraderie and friendship. That's why I named that ship Friendship in the first place. I never dreamed this. His quiet words fell like a hammer on the spirits of those who watched the screen. Aliens, strangely beautiful in a way, with multicolored wings and round heads, rushed forward on 4 legs, and with long curling tongue-like organs, stabbed the bodies of the scientists on board the exploratory vessel Friendship. The screams were not short-lived as the aliens rose up, yanked the frail bodies of the scientists towards them, and then began to tear into their flesh. The sound of snapping limbs was drowned out only by the cries of agony and pleas for mercy from the crew. Gabriel could only watch, along with the rest of his people, as the scientists and the ship's crew were dissected alive by the dark curiosity of the invaders. Cameras were everywhere on exploratory vessels, and so there wasn't a single detail to be missed, not one desperate flail, not one heart-wrenching wail, not one little cry as someone was allowed, blessedly, to die. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Gabriel trembled as his friends perished before his eyes. Most of them were known to him since their earliest days in the academy. All of them on the day of the launch he'd envied for their chance to sail between the stars in search of new life and new civilizations, going so boldly out where no human had ever gone before. And this is their reward. He gritted his teeth as if their anguish ended his and birthed rage in its place. A handful, only a handful, of crew members survived long enough that the aliens who boarded the ship decided to leave with them. The recording automation on the ship worked even without people, and so he and the rest of the horrified staff could watch as the long, almost caterpillar-shaped ships began to pull away. They could only watch as the weapons turned on the Terran ship, glowed, and then fired. The detonation cut off the transmission and denied the dead even the dignity of burial at home, leaving whatever scraps of them to survive the blast to float in the icy and endless void of space until the end of time. "We have the transmission, all of it?" Gabriel asked as sweat ran down his face. "We do," the intern said. Tears were on his face. Gabriel could see them out of the corner of his eye. The young man had made friends with some of the crew before launch. He had even expressed interest in joining them on one of their missions one day, and now that wasn't going to happen. They destroy our friendship. I suppose only time will tell if they regret it or not, Gabriel said as steel resolve settled into his gut. He turned and put his hand on the shoulder of the pimply-faced young intern. "Lad, route that transmission to the global news networks, then upload it to the common use net and to the president in that order." "But, sir," the young man sniffled and wiped a bit of snot from his nose, "aren't we supposed to route it to the government first?" "You're right, and you'll be fired for following my orders because I'm going to deny giving them. But if you do as I tell you, there's a good chance that we'll at least be able to return the greeting those aliens gave to us. If you don't, it'll get buried, maybe even lied about, and they'll all be forgotten." "Sir, when I get fired, can you get me a job somewhere else?" the young man asked, and at that, Gabriel nodded. "Making twice what you're making here. I can promise you that," he said, and then watched as the young intern hastened away. His feet were the only noise in the room. Gabriel had no doubt his words had been heard by a dozen or more people. But the people on the Friendship had been their friends too, and outrage, or revenge, or both, would be enough to buy their silent cooperation. An hour later, news organization notices buzz on phones all over the world. This footage will be sensitive to most viewers. Please do not watch this where children may observe. It was a sort of warning that guaranteed people would check out the subject, and so the screams of the dying were heard all over Earth, and phones began to ring as scientists were called for commentary. Gabriel didn't bother to check to see what the video hosting services were doing. He simply went into his private office, sat down, and removed his phone from his pocket. It was warm to the touch, no doubt from one of the little mobile games he sometimes played to pass the time. He set it on the desk and looked down at it. He didn't have to wait long. It buzzed angrily up at him, shaking enough that it actually moved a few inches across the shiny, flat wooden surface. Gabriel tapped the screen to answer the call and set it on speaker. "Dr. Coleman, have you lost your goddamn mind?" Gabriel took a deep breath and looked at the screen. It was a video call. "No, Mr. President, not at all. A man who had, as you so eloquently put it, lost his goddamn mind would have sent that to you without making damn sure it wasn't forgotten." President Whitman's tan face was red with anger as he snapped back. "You're taking this too personally. Do you know what kind of panic you just set off? I'm sure I have a clue about their panic, and you're damn right I take it personally. The friendship was my idea. How could I not take it personally that all those friends and colleagues of mine died?" President Ronald Whitman stood up and set his hands on the desk, as if to challenge the larger, younger man across the miles. Dr. Gabriel Coleman stood up in the same way and hovered over the phone, so he was looking down at it. "For starters, Mr. President, our power readings indicated that their engine efficiency was far below our own, and we encountered them in an area with nothing else around it, indicating that this was also outside of their territory. The weapon readings we were able to record were also far below our current capabilities. It may be that they have a colony nearby, but if it were so far advanced that we had some reason to worry, we should have picked up some kind of signal." Gabriel laid his points out in plain language, and the red anger began to drain from Whitman's slightly pudgy face. Could those have been, I don't know, pirates? Brigands of some sort? Perhaps a criminal element not affiliated with whatever government they have? The president's question was a good one, and Gabriel shrugged. "I can't say. It certainly didn't look like it was in the state of repair you'd expect out of space pirates. But how likely is it that space pirates will ever be a real thing, anyway? No. I believe our starship just had the misfortune to travel into the path of a very hostile people who, like ourselves, are just beginning to seize the stars. Just as our star harvesters are creating energy banks to fuel the hyperlanes, and our terraformers are preparing worlds to become ideal homes for us, I believe they are trying to expand their borders themselves." Gabriel tried to sound more confident than he was, and in that, he was well practiced. In truth, he had his doubts. But in that short recording of data, it was indisputable that there were no forms of energy banks. The enemy vessel was not as advanced as those of Earth's military, and there was no sign of civilization in any of the other star systems they'd visited in the previous years. Also in his favor, or rather Earth's favor, the Friendship was one of a small fleet of 7 science vessels meant to explore far beyond the fleet of construction ships in part of a multi-stage plan of expansion and settlement. The science vessels would go out, scan for life and habitats, identify and tag useful resources, and then, after transmitting their findings to the construction fleet, move on. Then, the construction fleet would follow, establish a starbase that would harvest energy from the local sun, build mining and harvesting operations, and then drop the autoformer on the desired worlds. After transmitting the locations back to Earth, the construction fleet would move on again. Then back on Earth, everyone who registered as a would-be colonist would receive a notice of opportunity, a map of the area, and a projection of what it would look like when the planet had been turned into a new Eden in which to live. The colonists would then buy land that would build the colony ship, and when, after a few years, the terraforming was complete, the colony ship would launch and settle on a new world. It's worked very well so far. We haven't expended too much in the way of money. We haven't wasted our resources. And we haven't needed to put much into the military beyond improving what we could build. But now, after that, Gabriel shivered again. The call for a military buildup and to punish those aliens would be inexorable. Ronald had calmed down at last after the minute of silence settled between them. No doubt he'd been coming to the same conclusion. We'll raise armies and start building a fleet immediately. Transmit the designs I know you've been working on off to the Defense Department as soon as possible. I have to go and address the world." The president sighed, and Gabriel felt his first twinge of guilt. "I'm sorry to put you into this position, Ron, but I can't regret having done it. I'll throw some favorable commentary your way when I do my interview, Gabriel promised and sat back down. His chair squeaked under him, and he picked up the phone to hold it at eye level. Don't worry about it, the president remarked. I might have done the same thing. Hell of a way to die, but at least it wasn't in vain. These fiends really showed their hand early. We'll make them pay for that, even if it takes years to get ready. In the meantime, I'll assign people to learning their language, and we'll get more ships mission, and hopefully we'll catch these bastards napping. Yes, sir, Mr. President, Dr. Coleman replied, and the call came to a close. When the president hung up, it felt strange to get up the next day, and the next, and the next. If any of the others felt the same as himself, they didn't say it. But for Gabriel Coleman, it was strange to think of human corpses, burnt ruins, and ashes of ambition and humanity floating through space billions of miles from the planet they evolved on. And worse, that it happened because of some other chance evolutionary path on a world no human had ever seen. Life continued to carry on, and shipyards continued to expand until they were capable of harboring the massive battleships that were now much more than merely conceptual plans. They were real, physical, tangible things, and tours of them in their shipyards became a popular way to help fund their creation. It was 2 years later that the aliens became the go-to villain in video games and popular media, but Gabriel only went about his day, avoiding all of it. He only briefly appeared in a documentary, End in the Void, depicting the lives and deaths of the people aboard the Friendship. Only one other exception occupied his time and study, and that was going to see the dramatization of the documentary. Not half bad. Except for Fred was gay and Alice didn't have a crush on him. They'd be mortified to know the director made that decision just because the actor and actress had chemistry together on screen. Other than that, they'd have been pleased, all of them. It was a good enough film to win a few awards. Best Picture, Best Special Effects. But what really mattered in Gabriel's mind, as well as in the Office of Public Opinion, was how the film shaped the perspectives and views of humans, not just on Earth, but on the outlying colonies that were growing more important every day. New signals were coming in from the most distant star systems. And as Gabriel sat at his desk again, almost 9 years to the day after the first encounter with alien life, he could foresee future first contacts with yet more alien life in the deep Black Sea. How many peoples are there? What if they're all as dangerous as the other ones? What if they're more advanced than we are? What if we can't make it? He asked himself that a lot. Extinction. The word hung like a sword of Damocles above the entire race of man. Though outside of a handful of scientists, politicians, and military personnel, almost nobody knew of the other transmissions out there. Not yet. But language experts were closing in on the ability to speak with those new civilizations, even though most were focused on the one known to be hostile. He flipped on the local news on the common net and watched the newscasters standing on the flight deck. The Starfleet behind me is ready to launch in 1 hour, and when it does, it will make its way to the site of the destruction of the Starship Friendship. Once there, they will attempt to gather any remains they can before setting off to find the fiend boarders. After that, what happens is up to them. Again, it was an ominous thing to say, but most people didn't really know much about the aliens designated as the fiends. As such, there were a great many humans who feared the idea of conflict, wondering openly if one ship wasn't just an acceptable loss and whether or not they should make peace if they could. Both perspectives favored having a strong fleet, but the war between anger and fear had yet to end. Traveling out that far would take years more, and as such, most of the journey would be spent in a state of cryosleep for the crew. Gabriel shook his head. Madness. They had to have been searching for life as long as we have. What insanity is it to do that just to? He trailed off, unwilling to say the words aloud. To tear your brothers and sisters in the stars to pieces? A war fought between neighbors makes sense. But we're so far from one another. He stopped that train of thought. The engines and travel methods of hyperlanes meant that far away was now being redefined. Anywhere on Earth was now only an hour away, and the time it took to get to other colonies on other worlds was now the same amount of time it once took for their ancestors to go from the east to the west coast of North America. What will neighbors mean in another 100 years? Gabriel wondered and got back to work, preparing for the hell the future would bring to the people who slew his colleagues. Admiral Shia of the Adaka Empire stared at the screen in disbelief. Another pink one? He asked nobody in particular, and then his tongue stiffened as if to stab someone as the alien's words began to flow, not in the language of the pink ones, but in his own. The United Earth Empire sends its greetings, fiends. I am Admiral John Yamamoto. You perhaps remember us from the destruction and slaughter of our peaceful science ship, the Friendship, some time ago. We bore witness to your atrocities, and we remember. Now, we send our welcome to you in return. And now you will express your remorse, hand over those responsible, or, if you will not express an apology to us, you will express your regrets to one another. Admiral Shia's wings shivered. Where did this transmission come from? He demanded, and a subordinate seated nearby tapped the screen. Here, sir, he replied and revealed the transmission source. We'll send them lasers, not regrets. The Admiral wiggled with amusement. Send out some ships to that star system. Treat the creatures like the last time. They're the hardiest experimental animals we've ever had. It took 2 years to finish off that last batch. 6 vessels, each one the size of a village, winked out of view as they jumped into the hyperlane and towards the alien infestation on the border, coming all the way to the same place just to die all over again. They're even dumber than a Bacani. He thought of the subjected species that had been so recently conquered. On screen, I want to watch the... He didn't get to finish the sentence before his tongue stiffened in horror. His wings began to shake, and his was not alone. The fear swept through the entire room as the wings of every Adaka shivered enough to make their air move about the cause. The battleships on screen were hundreds of times the size of the small science vessel that had been previously destroyed, and there were dozens upon dozens of them. No! It can't be. It can't be. He felt his body release its waist onto the floor between his feet as the long ships of the pink ones, identified as Terran, began to glow at the gun ports. Get them out of there, the Admiral shouted, but the order was needless. The Adaka vessels were dwarfed by the massive ships and were as horrified, or worse, than the Admiral himself. They were scrambling, firing off their weapons as they wheeled about to return to the hyperlane distortion. For one mad moment, Admiral Shia hoped against hope that he would watch the Terran vessels explode like the science ship before it, only for the shots to strike at some invisible field, which briefly glowed with iridescent light, revealing that they had some knowledge of shield technology. And worse, that it was enough to stop at least a handful of attacks by lasers and torpedoes. The Terran ships revealed that the guns fired projectiles or blasts of white light, easily larger than the ships they were firing at. And without fail, they hit their marks. The Adaka vessels exploded in balls of white flame for a brief moment, and that was all the Admiral saw before the transmission of the Terran began again. This is Admiral John Yamamoto of Task Force Vengeance. Since you have ignored our warning and engaged in hostilities a second time, the price of our peace will be all of the energy harvesting stations surrounding your core worlds. And make no mistake, I am not asking you to cede them. I am informing you that we are coming to collect them. Any members of your crew still found on board those stations will be sent home within however long it takes for their body to float through space and hit the atmosphere of your home world. That is all. Contact the Kakik. Inform her we are at war with the Terran. The Admiral gave the directions to his subordinate and focused his own efforts on calming down as much as possible before he would have to address the assembly himself. We are the Adaka. We have never been defeated. We can't lose like this. We can't. We cannot. He told himself with frantic urgency as he batted his wings enough to fly out of the room and back to his office, repeating his denials while the memory of those battleships in his mind roared forward toward the debris of his punitive force, dared to argue quite convincingly that he was wrong. Admiral Yamamoto gave a quiet nod in the direction of the screen. The bursts of light flared and died in the dark, the same as the starship Friendship years before. His stony expression never changed as the lights died under the wave of darkness. His tongue was bound by the sanctity and brutality of the moment. His hands remained folded behind his back, and he recalled one of the horror movies he saw in theaters that came out 3 years after the destruction of friendship at first contact. In it, the destruction of the Adaka ships failed to kill those who sailed within, and they flew in to attack the Terran ship, resulting in fierce fighting and the hunting down of most of the men and women on board. Why do I love such god-awful movies? He asked himself with a shake of his head. But he then glanced in the direction of the sensor operator and said aloud, "Life signs?" "None, sir." The answer was calm and professional, as was to be expected of their bridge officers. But out of the corner of his eye, the Admiral saw the little smile on the man's face. "Did you lose someone?" John asked with quiet reverence and a hint of curiosity. And the Major answered at once, "My big brother." The officer's response was no surprise. Some of their top performers were relatives who joined the new Defense Force specifically in the hopes of avenging what was done to a loved one. The Admiral didn't offer condolences. Most people had heard enough of those over the years. Instead, he gave a slight tug to his uniform and readied himself. "Helm, adjust course. Head to the nearest Yadaka system. They have an energy collector that we need to collect." The Admiral's order was followed by the feeling of the starship banking slightly toward the hyperlane and the brief feeling of acceleration before the dampeners could cycle out the force. The stars became a blur. They went from dots to lines as the fleet streaked through the night along the thickened space lanes. It would still take 3 months of travel to reach their destination, but he had one advantage he was sure the Yadaka did not. "We've got a good idea of their territory, and I'm certain they have no idea what Earth has been up to these last 7 years. Oh well, they messed around. Now they find out." Admiral Shia's mind was haunted by the absolute destruction of their punitive force, but he took comfort in the fact that the Kakik was a wise female whose guidance had never steered them wrong in the past. The Julians, the Matra, the LSA, all gave their territory a wide berth because of her aggressive policy of destroying vessels that entered territory the Yadaka desired. However bad things might have seemed, they could be worse. We still have the rest of the Armada, and we have our shipyards fully automated. They began building vessels as soon as the first ones were destroyed. Also, they must supply themselves from afar. Those were comforting thoughts to cling to as he stilled his wings and lowered his whole body to the floor in front of the Kakik's throne and gave his report of events. The throne room of their home world was a dimly lit place. It kept the vibrant colors of visitors dulled, but the throne was the exception. There, light was always streaming through a series of windows, which angled the light directly toward the throne and nowhere else. As a result, the ruler was always the brightest in the room, a display that never failed to put others into a state of awe. And it did not fail now as he explained it all and awaited her answer. "We will meet them with swarms. Their ships are large and powerful," she admitted, "but they fire few shots. If they cannot hit, they cannot kill. We need only be many, and in this way, the bugs may conquer the beast." She didn't lose her temper, though the long tongue that vibrated out her words was stiffer than usual. He couldn't help but admire her collected state and the rapidity with which she came up with a strategy that might have some possibility of success. "I will see to it personally, my Kakik," the Admiral vowed, and she only fluttered her wings in acknowledgement. The bright colors danced along the floor thanks to the rainbow her wings created. He crawled back out the way he'd come to prepare to resist the alien invaders. Mentally, Shia had already cast off any hope of defending the first solar collection stations, and he ordered only skeleton crews of expendable individuals to be left behind to put up at least a show of defiance. The little fleets were ordered to pull back, while the shipyards went into overdrive, churning out small, cheap frigates that required little to no crew, while also adding a small number of slightly more powerful vessels that still had less in terms of firepower and more in terms of maneuverability in their favor. Day after day, he prepared, working with only his most trusted aides. He watched every transmission that came his way. In the second lunar cycle of the home world, he saw the human fleet emerge from the hyperlane and go straight for the collector. It had few weapons, only enough to defend against pirates, pests, or destroy asteroids that came their way, which meant 2 platforms and a central rotating gun connected to the power core. The humans bathed the guns in the light of their weapons, and then docked their ships. Shia swapped to the internal monitors to watch the battle. In contrast to the soft bodies of the frail prey he remembered, these were almost a different breed, large, powerfully built, and clad in thick armor. The human marines carried large guns tipped with sharp blades. They shouted as they came on, their weapons spitting bright beams down the hall, and Shia felt a core of fear grow in his gut. The human marines were moving in small teams that seemed to have been drilled on how to maneuver through the halls of a Yadaka construct. How did they know this much, he wondered. It just didn't seem likely that they would coincidentally use the same construction methods as his people.